are doing the entire book of James this morning, so we will not probably leave James except for maybe a brief kind of side into the book of Proverbs for just a couple minutes. But if you want to open up to the book of James, that's where we'll be this morning. We're going to do the entire book. As I mentioned, we've been covering it this entire quarter. We started with an overview. We're going to finish with an overview. And we'll take this pretty much the same way we took the first week. We'll kind of go the entire quarter. We'll go piece by piece through the first chapter, kind of make big themes about the entire book. That's the way we've taken this book the entire quarter. Is James chapter 1 is a summary of the entire book. And so that's going to be kind of how we address this morning. So this will be kind of a good catch-up for some people. It'll be a good kind of summary for others. As I mentioned on Wednesday night, if you were one of the, I think, 19 people that requested James on our survey last year, I hope this has been a fulfilling quarter for you. If not, then stick around for another decade and I'll probably do it then again. That's probably when we go through the cycle. But James, what we're going to be doing this morning, we'll finish it up. I do want to make mention of next quarter. The workbooks for next quarter are on the back already. Some of you may have grabbed them. But on Sunday mornings, what we're going to be discussing, and I'm sure this is either going to get groans or some very loud hurrahs from a few select individuals. Next Sunday morning, what we're going to be discussing is an epic 6-book Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles harmony. I can feel the eye roll as soon as I said that. There's something like 160 some odd chapters in that. I mentioned on Wednesday night that David by itself is like 55 chapters. We are not going to be doing a verse-by-verse study. That's not on the radar at all, as I mentioned Wednesday night. My whole goal for this is for it not to be confusing. That's my whole goal for this. Biblical knowledge comes in second. But this is designed to not be confusing. So the way that we're going to do it is not, as I mentioned, a verse-by-verse study. It is going to be chronological, canonical rather. But the way that we're going to be doing is zooming out and taking more of a thematic approach to it. So when we talk about David, we're not necessarily going to be discussing David and Bathsheba by itself. We're going to be looking at the big themes in regards to Chronicles. When we get to 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, that's probably where we'll get into the weeds a little bit. And I say that very lovingly towards Scripture. But Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles Harmony, all 6 books starting next Sunday. And then on Wednesday, as a complimentary class to that, we're going to be discussing the prophets. We're going to take one chapter out of every, or most of the minor prophets, and kind of look at it in a historical context. These are designed to be complementary, and so if you can make Sunday and Wednesday throughout this quarter, my prayer is that you will be benefited by it. But I'm anticipating a great class. I geek out about the history stuff, so I've been looking forward to Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles all year. I know everybody else is as well. At least I hope that everybody else is. I hope at least one person is. But I think it'll be a good quarter. Before we go any further into our class for this morning, though, we're going to ask Kyle, if he doesn't mind, to lead us in a word of prayer.
Would you pray with me, please? Heavenly Father, as we enter into this period of study, we're so thankful for the teachers in this hour, the ones that are leading classes. We hope and pray that they would have a ready recollection of those things that they prepared, that they'd be able to aptly teach those so we might make the necessary application in our life. Father, we ask that you would help us to remove those things from our mind that might be a hindrance to our study here this morning. We might be able to focus solely on what our purpose is. Thanks in the name of Christ.
Amen. Thank you. Before we go any further, I want to ask one question that's kind of a big nebulous question, but this will be kind of a good way to get the morning going. What has been, as you look back at the book of James, those of you who have been here at least most of the time, what has been the one verse or the one concept of James that jumped out at you? Maybe that you didn't anticipate going in, maybe you hadn't really studied that in depth. But what are some of your favorite parts of the book of James? Or do you have your favorite parts of the book of James? This may be a crawl to finish for some of us. Right. Hasn't already come, then it certainly is going to be coming soon. Right. I think that's really the lens that you have to look at James through. Not only the persecution, as you mentioned, but as you also mentioned, kind of this Messianic Jewish idea of it. And so when you look at the book of James as a whole, all 5 chapters, you have to take it through that Jewish context. What is it that these people specifically would be going through? If you place it within Jerusalem around AD 45, AD 55, somewhere in that time span, what are these people going through in that time period specifically? So I think kind of, as you mentioned, looking at it in the practical aspects. And I think that's where James really soars Obviously, it's a great book by itself, but I think it really soars in its practical aspects. Not too heavy on the theology, although it does touch on that, but really in its practicality. Yes, sir?
I agree. I like the whole book. I've always liked it. But the part about you can't be saved by faith alone.
Right.
The biggest area in the New Testament where we can prove that. And to be able to read the book of James and still be convinced to be saved by faith only is, I just don't understand.
Yeah.
You know, it just shreds the doctrine of faith alone.
Right.
You have to deliberately do something.
Well, and ironically, it talks about self-delusion towards the end of chapter 1. And so not only do you have to kind of misuse certain passages, but you also have to just completely ignore what the teaching should be. And so James not only does a great job of kind of destroying this Calvinistic idea of faith only, or I guess a non-denominational version of faith only salvation, but also does a really good job at showing how we need to look inwards to see if we're following that. Because some of us may, and we didn't really make this point throughout the quarter, some of us may believe in faith only without really knowing that we believe in faith only. To say, well, I go to church twice a week, or I do this, or I do that. It's important to take the whole, take all of it, and really examine ourselves to see whether we're in the faith. Yes, ma'am, Mindy?
Oh, yeah, I haven't been in my Bible class in a long time.
That's okay, you can still make a comment. Howard does that all the
The
time.
faith verse, it's talking about faith without works is dead.
Right.
And,
Yeah. Yeah, that's the big behemoth section, chapter 2. And chapter 1 obviously leads into that. And it's kind of jarring if you just read it, because James, the second chapter, the first several verses are talking about income inequality and how we handle our brethren and sister in relationships, if I can use that word. So then it leads into this faith and works idea, and that all builds on each other. But you're exactly right. Faith and works is a big part of it. Zach?
One that always stands out to me is going to be James 4 and verse 6 and verse 10. God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. And then he says, humble yourself before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Every topic we bring up in the book of James can largely be summed up as a problem of pride.
Right.
And that's why I think that passage is so key to understanding everything he's talking about there, because if you're proud, you're not going to obey.
Right.
And if you're humble, you're not gonna exalt yourself over your brother, even
Right.
if he's more poor or has some kind of situation going on. So that has always kind of been a key understanding for me.
Right. And that goes in with chapter 1 where he says, receive the implanted word in meekness, which is able to save your souls. I think humility is a big part of that, which then goes into the verses that follow that say, don't just be hearers, but be doers also. Really examine yourself in the mirror. And so, yeah, I think humility is a big one. I think sometimes it's kind of I don't know if it's a cliche is the right word. Sometimes it's easy to say that, pride is the enemy, the biggest enemy of all of us. But James makes that point very deliberately here. And it's easy to do that with other books, but that's James's point. I think Zach brings it up. I think that's the next one I want to bring up too. When you look at what Zach mentioned in James chapter 4, my favorite section follows that. When you look at verses 13 through 18, I don't know how many times I've read James, probably not as many as some people here. But when you look at James 4, 13 through 18, he very simply says, who of you claims that they have wisdom? Let him show by his actions whether or not he has wisdom. I never really stopped to think about the implications of that, because it's easy for us to say, I have this, or I believe in this, or look at who I am. But really, as we've kind of outlined so far, your actions dictate what you really are. And we've discussed that throughout the course of this quarter, but that section just kind of jumped out to me specifically. Does anybody else have any favorite verses or concepts? Yeah, Ben?
Well, along that same line, I was considering the first chapter where it talks about if you want wisdom, ask God.
Right.
But it's conditional. It can be almost like Solomon, and that if you ask for wisdom and you mean it, he'll give it to you without question. So the wisdom to be able to handle handle partiality, handle division, everything else comes from the ability to handle wisdom.
Right.
And I'm not sure very many of us understand it's available. We can do it. It's just can we handle it?
Well, and that's a good point too. Yeah, can we handle? I wasn't going to end with that, but that's a good point too. Can we handle what God gives us? Solomon obviously couldn't. Solomon had vast amounts of wisdom, but you can see once again through his life that it kind of went downhill in a hurry. But I think that's true. Wisdom is available for all of us if we would ask for it, but we don't ask for it. And that's one of the interesting things about James is these things are not hard. James is not a hard book to really conceptualize. It's a hard book to put into practice. And that's where Joe was talking about the practicality just kind of screams. When you look at In my opinion, some of the things that jump out about the book of James by itself, to me, you can't look at the book of James without noticing how blunt it is. It doesn't really pull punches. It doesn't beat around the bush. How does James end? The end of James chapter 5, how does it end? He doesn't say hello to this guy, say hello to this guy, grace and peace be with you. How does it end?
An admonition to just look to your wayward brethren and see if you can restore them.
Right, look to your wayward brethren, see if you can restore him, and sing. That's it. So he doesn't dilly-dally around, to quote one of my dad's favorite phrases, but he doesn't just kind of mess around. He gets to the point, he moves on to his next point. So James is very blunt. It's also very deep. As we mentioned, also it's very practical, but James is surprisingly deep. And on the surface, it doesn't look very deep, but I think one of the areas you can see its depth is in the Old Testament references. We'll discuss that a little bit this morning, not in a great, huge context, but it calls a lot of the Old Testament back to mind, obviously given its status talking to Jews, but it also calls the Beatitudes, it calls several messages from Jesus into mind. So it goes deep and it brings everything kind of to bear within one book. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a good book. When you look at James chapter 1, we'll kind of step through, as I mentioned, we'll step through James chapter 1 kind of piece by piece. How does James open? With verse 2, rather, not with verse 1. What's the very first thing he addresses?
Temptations.
Right. Right, temptations.
What you gain from.
Right, what you gain from temptations, which seems like it would be an oxymoron. What do we generally think when we think of persecutions, temptations? What do we generally try to do with those things? We try to escape them. Yeah, that's one thing. Just run in the opposite direction, screaming, dead.
Blame God.
We blame God, which he addresses later in this chapter. Yeah, we blame God for them. What else do we do with them? We complain about them. Yes, we do. Yes, we whine. We don't whine. What are you talking about? Humans don't do that. What else? I'm sorry?
Like we ask for patience, and then we got all trials and trial and grace. So
Yeah.
what are you doing to me, God?
Right. Which, hey, praying for patience. Yeah. Praying for patience is simultaneously the best and the worst prayer that we should ever utter, but I think it comes in handy in a lot of ways. Yeah. What else do we do when persecutions or temptations show up?
Categorize them as all bad.
Yeah, we categorize them as all bad, they're all evil, I wish they would all just go away. I think what we sometimes do is we just kind of endure them. We just kind of sit in our little corner, we close our eyes, we just wait for it to go away. Yeah, is that James's attitude towards temptations and persecutions, or is it something different?
His attitude is face it head on and endure it.
Right.
Come out stronger.
Right, face it head on, endure it. What does he say specifically there in verse 2? Count it all joy. What does he mean when he says count it all joy?
Turn it into something positive.
Right.
Consider it a challenge. You're capable of facing.
That's a good way to put it. Consider it a challenge. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of approach towards it. Howard?
Seems to me like as a accounting term, like count it all good, this one,
Yeah.
this one, the other.
I can't speak to the accounting phrase because I did not do well in that class, but yeah.
In other words, we tend to put on the minus side and it should be on the plus side.
Right. Right. We tend to put it on the minus side and we should put it on the plus side. And that kind of goes with James chapter 1 as a whole, because a lot of the things we would think, James says that's not necessarily the case. And that's another thing that he does throughout the entire book, is he challenges our assumptions about ourselves, challenges our assumptions about the world around us. But you're right, count it all joy, my brother, when you go into various trials. You never see anybody put on a Facebook status, I am so thankful I am going through persecutions today. And I don't think that's necessarily what he's after here. As Howard mentions, we should view it more as a plus. How do we count it as joy? Not that you should put it on your Facebook, by the way.
Well,
Mindy, go ahead. No, Mindy, you had your hand. That's all right. We'll go through all 100 other people, and then we'll come back to you here in a minute. Linda, go ahead.
oh, well, this may seem silly, but it needs to be silly. If, the devil knows who he already has.
Mhm.
That there goes, because he's in my camera, she's in my camera. So we're going to have to work on that one.
Right.
I need to work on these people that think they're in God's pocket,
That's a good point, and I've heard people make that phrase, and I think that's a good point to bring up. Is we tend to compartmentalize Satan as going after the people in the bars and that type of stuff.
Trophy.
Right.
You know, if we're,
Yeah.
if we feel like, you know, we're, okay, I'm gonna be unmovable.
Right.
I'm gonna stick to this to my dying day, and these kind of going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
We'll just see about it.
the first chapter of Job shows that. If God had, when God shows up Job, where he says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" that is more or less a challenge to Satan. That's not the way it was phrased. That's the way it seems like Satan has kind of conceptualized it. And so, right, he's not after the people at the bars. I mean, I guess a little bit. You're always trying to keep those. But he's after Christians. That's one thing that Peter makes very aware as well. Mindy, go ahead.
Came to mind, we should count it off, because when we're being tested and tried, we know God with us.
Right.
God, if God didn't love us, God wouldn't.
That's true, yeah.
That's all supposed to be tests and.
Right. It's a little bit of 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 13 in there a little bit. Yeah, they all passed through the sea, they all were baptized in the same thing, but they didn't all make it to Canaan. And so I think a little bit of that is in James chapter 1. Zach, go ahead.
I think just the context itself spells out why we should count it all joy. Because it says, "For you know the testing of your faith produces steadfastness."
Right.
You know you're not going through these trials of faith for no reason.
Exactly.
And so he goes on to say, let steadfastness have its full effect. You may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If I know that this is a token, and that's kind of how Peter would put it later, if I know that this is a token that I am doing what is right, I'm standing where I should be standing, because the apostles in Christ went the same thing,
Right.
and I'm in good company, and that should be a token that I'm doing something right.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to bring up. And you mentioned Jesus and the apostles. John chapter 14, verse 1, he talks about, don't be troubled. I'm going to go away to prepare a place for you. The very last thing that he says before he goes into the garden to pray his high priestly prayer is he says, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." And so that kind of provides nice bookends to his intermediate section, which talks about persecutions and trials and that type of stuff. But I think that's a good point to bring up. Ken?
I was just going to say, I think if we understand from God that we are all going to face trials, and we all do,
Right.
then we won't panic.
Right.
Because of it, we'll be able to endure it.
Right.
And it not only will help establish and build our faith in God, it'll also help us to deal with those around us that are going through similar trials
Right.
and troubles, to be able to help them too.
Yeah, and that's the second big point I wanted to bring up. The point that Zach made, which I think is kind of his overall statement here, is realizing that temptations and trials and persecutions, you're not just going through them to go through the motions. You're actually growing through them. And so when I made the point about we need to view trials differently, that's the way we need to view it. Not necessarily as something we just kind of sit and endure, but something we can grow through. That's the point that I wanted to make. And what Ken said, I think, is exactly right as well. We tend to look at persecution as being a negative. We look at it as, I'm doing something wrong, or at the very least, we take it as a surprise. And if you realize that it's not a surprise, you're ready for it, you can approach it the right way, and I think that's a lot of what he says too. Paul?
I was going to say, kind of what Zach was saying, verse 2, if you read it alone, it's just a standalone verse that makes no sense.
Right.
Because that's completely counter to human nature. And he explains that in verse 3, so you can't understand verse 2 until you read verse 3.
Right.
Zach said, and that answers the question that comes in our mind when we read verse 2.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you have to kind of take it in context. By itself, verse 2 would just seem ridiculous. Why would he even say something like that? And I think the reason we correlated James chapter 1 with the rest of the book is when you look at what we correlated with in James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11, we won't take the time to read all of it, but the point that he makes in James 5, 7 through 11 is be patient. The farmer waits for the produce of the crops. Job was patient. And so when you're going through these persecutions, these trials, be patient because there's something that it's producing. And that's, I think, a good kind of companion passage to it. Yes, ma'am.
And exactly what you were just saying is if you are an alcoholic and you know that will always be a temptation to you, each time that you walk away from that, you become stronger against it because you always remember that those who are faithful will be rewarded again.
Right.
And like for that person, that will always be a temptation with them, but the strength of it will be lessened each time
Right.
they get through staying away from it.
Right.
And it could be any temptation.
Right. You are a stronger person after you go through temptation than before you go through temptation. It's just a natural byproduct of going through that process. You're always going to be stronger. And of course, I love to make fitness analogies because that's just what I know. It's what I'm very familiar with. I just started laughing way before anybody else did. But that's the way muscles are designed. You tear them down, you build them bigger. And so that's the way persecution, in a little bit, is designed to be too. And even if you look at Job by himself, I would argue that Job is a much stronger person by the end of the book than he was at the beginning. Even as great as he was much stronger at the end because he had gone through those things. He had a much fuller understanding of who God was, much fuller understanding of who he was, and I think he's a better person at the back end because of that. What's the next thing that he talks about in James chapter 1, after trials and temptations, persecutions? You don't have to laugh, by the way, when I make jokes about that. What's the next thing he talks about in James 1? Wisdom, exactly. What's his point in talking about wisdom? Ask for it, exactly. It seems so simple. Why do we not ask for wisdom? That's probably a lot of it. We don't ask for wisdom because we don't think we need it, which goes once again with the mirror analogy. Look, see where you're at, act accordingly. Yeah. Why do we not ask for wisdom? Yeah, we don't. I don't know if you're giggling or not, but I think that's a very applicable statement. Because if we ask for wisdom, then we have responsibility to use it, and that nobody wants that. We just kind of want to float as easily as possible. Howard?
We have to acknowledge that we're lacking in wisdom.
That's true, which is another thing we don't want to do. And that kind of goes with what Linda mentioned. I don't want to ask for wisdom because then that would acknowledge that there's something that's lacking in my life. Yeah.
Pride issue.
Once again, it's a pride issue, and it is a pride issue. All of it leads up to humility. Yeah. Why else do we not ask for wisdom? You put all those to the side. Why is it that we sometimes don't ask for wisdom? Kyle, go ahead.
I think sometimes, just like with any other prayer, it doesn't come in the form that we always think it should. And
Right.
so, I think sometimes that we ask for wisdom and we feel like we don't get it, but really it's just not coming in the form or in the clothes that we sometimes think it should.
Right. I think that's a true statement. Sometimes we make this kind of Solomon, we want it the Solomon manner, where we go to sleep, we see God, He asks what we want, we tell Him, we wake up and we're already supercharged. Like that's what we want from our prayers sometimes. And that's hardly ever, I don't know, I guess I can't say never. I don't think that's really ever the way it's supposed to work, but you're right, we don't like the way that it's sometimes branded. Right, yeah, driving down the road all of a sudden just hits you. Yeah. Right, it is very subtle, exactly, yeah. Look at go ahead.
We can ask for wisdom, but if we don't know how to acquire it, it gains us nothing.
Right.
We've got to learn how to acquire it.
Right. Well, step one is asking for it, right. And then maybe God will help us along the way. Yeah, but you're right. I think if we don't know that God is the giver of wisdom, maybe this is kind of a corollary to your point. If we don't know that God is the giver of wisdom, then we won't ask Him for it. But yeah. Is that kind of what you were talking about? Or? Okay. I really thought you'd say not at all. I think one of the reasons, I'm sorry, Bobby?
Well, I think it's a faith issue.
It's a faith issue? Yes. That was what I was getting towards, yeah. When you look at the context of James 1:5-8, the question is not whether or not you're going to ask for it. He almost takes it as an assumption that you're going to ask for it. What's the qualifier that he puts on it? You have to ask in faith. What does that look like, asking in faith? That's one way to put it. Yeah. Right, knowing that God will provide. I think Nathan uses the NIV, so I don't think that was a good translation. Yeah, knowing that God will provide. Everyone chuckles very awkwardly. Yeah, knowing that God will provide. But what does that look like? Praying in faith.
But it also comes into account faith without works.
Right.
Because you can
Exactly.
You can ask in faith.
Right.
But it still will take some work to get there.
Exactly, and that goes back to Kyle's point. We don't like the way sometimes it's packaged. We don't like the idea that we have to pray for something and then actually, do something on the back end, which, once again, is James's whole point. You have to actually live like it. And so, if we're asking something in faith, we have to live like it. We can't just pray for it and then cross our fingers and hope that it hits us in the forehead while we're driving down the road. We do have to ask in faith, believing that God is going to give it to us. We have to have faith in that. If we don't ask in faith, then what? What does He compare us to? Right, double-minded man driven by the serpent of the sea. In other words, I'll go with this, I'll think about this, I'll assume that's important. And so we're kind of all over the place. Immediately after that, starting in verse 9, he talks about one of the subjects that he discusses more than anything else in the book of James And one of the subjects the New Testament discusses very heavily that we sometimes don't talk about, verses 9 through 11, the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position. The rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flower and grass, he will pass away. What is he teaching us in verses 9 through 11?
This life is terminal.
Right. This life is terminal, yes. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. That'd make a great bumper sticker. Yeah. This life is terminal. But why is that an important concept? Because you're exactly right. Why is it that he reminds us of that? Because we know that. Right. We have to make the most of the time. Right. But what is James's point?
Riches are going to end.
Riches are going to end. Right. But riches cannot do what?
Physical riches. You know, it's
Right,
like
physical
no
riches.
matter how much you acquire in this world,
Right.
it will not cover sin.
And will not cover, yeah, nice glance. Wealth will not cover up your sins. Now that's obviously, everyone knows that. But we sometimes believe that. Because when you look at, for instance, the rich young ruler that shows up to Jesus, and Jesus says, it's harder for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven, or a camel to go through the eye of a needle. It's hard for anybody to go through the eye of a needle. But it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter heaven. What's the disciples' response? Then who can be saved? Exactly. Why is it that they say that?
More people have a Job's friends mentality than we
Right.
would like to admit.
Exactly. And I would argue we sometimes even have a Job mentality. We tend to look at people who are successful and think, what about them?
They've done everything right.
Right. Did they've done everything right? Or what else?
Like God's just blessing them
Right.
over and over again, and He's not blessing me, and I'm doing what's right.
Right.
And my life's in line.
Which goes with our persecution mentality. If you take the flip side of it, persecution signals to us that we're doing something wrong. There's an error that I need to fix. But wealth, on the other hand, signifies that I'm doing something right. So I need to go down this path. And so that's the challenge. That's the assumptions that he's challenging here. When he says in verse 9, the brother of humble circumstances glory in your high position, what does he mean by that? And likewise, the rich man glories in humiliation. What's the high and low? 'Cause that's almost a juxtaposition there. Actually, it is one.
Except where you're at.
Except where you're at, yeah. I think that's a little bit of it. What else does he mean when he says that? The brother of humble circumstances to glory in your high position.
Brother, in humble circumstances has to rely on God.
Bingo. He has to rely on God because he doesn't what? He doesn't have any choice, exactly. He doesn't really have anything else in this world to get to. Look at Proverbs chapter 30. This is, I mentioned we'd be jumping out of James. This is that one time. Proverbs chapter 30 is not Solomon. Solomon would not write, I think, the last 2 chapters of the book of Proverbs. But in Proverbs chapter 30, he mentions in verses 7 through 9. And this is a great 3-verse section to just kind of keep and commit to memory. Verses 7 through 9 of Proverbs chapter 30, he says, 2 things I ask of you. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep deception and lies far from me, and give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I would not be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or that I would not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God. What is ager, or augur, however you want to pronounce it? What does augur encourage in Proverbs chapter 30? Or pray for?
He's thankful he's not rich.
He's thankful he's not rich, and he also prays that God would keep him from riches. Exactly. For what reason?
Because he sees the danger.
Sees the danger in it.
And He'd become proud and say, who's God?
Right, he would become proud and he would say, well, who's God? I don't need him. Yeah. Has that ever happened in the Bible before? Literally the entire Old Testament. All of the Jews is about that. And all of the Old Testament about the Jews is about that. Because in the book of Deuteronomy, they say you're going to go into the Canaan land and you're going to be rich and you're going to be plentiful. Do not let your heart go away from God. Remember who it was that brought you into that. And so the same statement is made in Proverbs chapter 30. The exact same thing I think is made in James chapter 1. The brother of humble circumstances to glory in his high position. The brother of rich circumstances glory in your low position. Realize that what you have really doesn't amount to much on an eternal scale. Remember what your humility or remember what your wealth truly consists of. I think that's what he's saying there in James chapter 1. He also touches on, starting in verse 12, probably one of the most jarring, at least straightforward things that he says. In verses 12 down through verse 16, what is he teaching us?
Don't give up when you're under in a trial. When your trials
That's true, right. A little bit. It's a little bit like verses 2 through 4. Keep going. As a matter of fact, verse 12 almost sounds like a beatitude at the beginning of it. God doesn't tempt, exactly. We know that, but why do we forget it? We do want to do it our way. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Why is it that we sometimes blame God for what happens in our life, or our sins, or he what? Right, he is in control. Yeah. If he's in control, then he should have kept me from this. Yeah. Yeah. Did your dad teach you that? Why else is it? Why else is it that we blame God for it? Nathan doesn't use an NIV, by the way. It's okay. Why else is it that we blame God?
Because when we put the responsibility on ourselves,
Right.
then it just means that we have more that we need to do.
Right. And Nathan was exactly right. If we're able to say, well, God's in control, then he should have kept me from this, then the responsibility all of a sudden shifts off of us and it's now on God. So when he says this in this passage, let no one say, verse 13, when he is tempted, I'm tempted by God. For God can't be tempted by evil, and he himself doesn't tempt anyone. What does he immediately say right after that?
This is where sin comes from.
Exactly. In case you're wondering where sin comes from, this is where sin comes from. It comes when you're drawn away by your own lust and enticed. Don't blame God for your own issues. Look at James chapter 4. This is the corollary that we made with this. In James 4, starting in verse 1, it's almost like a complete... It's almost like he's parodying himself from chapter 1. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? In case you were wondering. Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and don't have, so you commit murder. You're envious and can't obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You don't have, once again, verse 5 through 8 of chapter 1, because you don't ask. You ask and then don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God? Whoever then therefore wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think the Scripture speaks to no purpose? He jealously desires the Spirit which he has made to dwell in us, but he then gives us a greater grace. Therefore it says, God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among us, according to James 4? Pride. But on a more specific note, that's kind of
Selfishness.
selfishness, exactly. It's not necessarily pride, although that's a part of it. The real source of our quarrels is selfishness. And when you look back at James chapter 1, that's the point that he's making here. If you're saying to yourself, I can't be held accountable for my sins, it's God's fault, you're basically exalting yourself at the expense of God. He flips the script in James chapter 1 and verses 12 down through verse 16. And then in verses 17 down to verse 18, what does he say? If the opposite of God having no association with sin, what is the opposite of God having no association with sin?
He gives every good and perfect gift.
Right, that he gives every good and perfect gift. Does that have a personal application to us? It's a very rare or random question. But does this have a very personal application to us? We know who God is. What does that say about us? Yeah, you are a good and perfect gift, Joe. That's exactly right. Yeah, I see where you're going at. I think that's a fair statement. What does that say about us, though?
We have value to God.
We have value to God, true. I guess not that personal. I guess I should have backed off that statement. If we know that God cannot be responsible for sin, that sin originates with us, what does it say about our accomplishments, the things that we have in this life?
But they don't come from us, that they are blessings.
Every good and perfect gift comes from above, exactly. How do we generally look at these verses?
Look what I did.
Right, look what I did, look at what God did. God's responsible for my troubles, look at all the things that I did. And so what James is doing here in James chapter 1 is he's flipping the narrative. God is not responsible for your sins. You're the one that's responsible for your sins. I'm the one that's responsible. Verse 17 through 18, God is the Father of lights. He puts all of this in context of verse 16, and we talked about how it goes both ways. Verse 16, he says, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. It's easy for us to be deceived about both of those points. And I think that's a little bit of what he's addressing there. Anybody have any thoughts or comments before we go further? Okay, go ahead. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar learned that a couple times.
Is it at the bottom of the snare written?
Yeah, as far as I know. I don't know if our deacons have a problem with it, but yeah, you can. Just do as long as you remember what's God's word and what's your word. But yeah, you're right. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on James 1 up to verse 18? Okay, right after that, starting in verse 19, he has everybody's favorite phrase, which is what? Right, quick to hear, slow to speak, and Joyce, you missed one. slow to anger. I'm trying to be slow to anger right now, right? Why does he say this in verse 19? Quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Right. And he qualifies verse 19 by bringing in verse 20. The anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. What does that mean, verse 20? You like how I just keep saying things and asking what do they mean? That's a big point, right. You're not going to be right in the sight of God unless you can control your language or your words, your actions, yeah. What else does that mean, though?
I think a lot of what James is going to say, has said, and will say in this letter is provocative. And he's saying, look, if your reaction is to try and rebut what I'm going to tell you, rich man, or whoever you may be, he's saying, look, you need to slow down, be quick to hear what I'm saying, slow to respond to it, be slow to anger about it, because this is for your benefit. And it would be easy to try and justify yourself, but swallow that for a second and listen to what he's saying.
Right, and to put it that way, it almost seems like it should appear at the beginning of every letter. But you're exactly right. I think James's rhetoric, especially the closer you get towards the end, the more the rhetoric seems to amp up. For instance, when you get to chapter 5, we looked over this earlier, but when you look at the first couple of verses of chapter 5, this is a very inflammatory type statement. We mentioned how 100 years ago, I think somebody read this to a group of businessmen and ascribed it to Emma Goldman, who was a known anarchist at the time, and everybody just kind of ran with it. But in chapter 5, when he says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted." That's very inflammatory style language. But what's his point in saying that? It's useless, exactly. So the closer you get towards the end of James, the more his rhetoric amps up, the more it becomes pointed, the more it becomes kind of direct. What else is his point in saying, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man doesn't achieve the righteousness of God?
God is love.
Okay, God is love. Build on that a little bit.
Well, your anger doesn't achieve that at all. It's completely opposite.
Well, somebody would go back to say, well, Jesus flipped over tables, God is love. Put the two together. I'm not saying I would.
Okay.
There is such a thing as righteous anger.
There is such a thing as righteous anger, but I think this is a little bit what Ken's getting at.
Romans 12, verse 9. It says, let love be without hypocrisy.
Right.
Abhor what is evil. So
Right.
Jesus turning over the tables is because he abhorred what was evil.
Right, and I think that's getting a little closer to what I was talking about. But you're right. Jesus turning over the tables and laying changers, that whole thing was prefaced by saying, you have made my house, or made my father's house, a den of thieves. But then the apostles, remember right after that was quoted in the Old Testament, zeal for thy house is consuming. And so Jesus certainly has righteous anger in that, which I think goes into James 1. But what does he mean when he says the righteousness of man doesn't achieve the anger of man doesn't achieve the righteousness of God? And I think what Ken was hitting on was closer towards it.
Be angry all you want, it's not going to change God's way.
Right, be angry all you want, it's not going to change God's way.
Well, great. I think this anger that he's talking about, the anger of man versus the anger of God, or righteous anger, this is self-serving anger.
Bingo, exactly. Right, and we brought up all the very 2019 parallels of when you're cut off in traffic as you're going into the line at Taco Bell. You're cut off in traffic and you immediately think what? I'm going to get out of my car and I'm going to what? I'm going to steal his chalupa. That's what I was going to say about that. Yes. I'm going to go up and I'm going to steal that guy's food. I'm going to do something on my horn. I'm going to say some stuff to him, whatever it is. I think that's a little bit of what he's addressing here, because what does that not achieve? The anger of man.
It doesn't do much of anything in a lot of circumstances.
It doesn't do anything except land you in jail for a misdemeanor, yeah.
Or raise your blood pressure.
Yeah.
And that last verse of Proverbs 30 says, the churning of anger produces strife.
Right.
So you just create some unnecessary turmoil in a lot of these situations. That,
Right.
That are just not good for you in any way, spiritually or physically or otherwise.
Right. You create unnecessary turmoil, but what you don't achieve is just as important. You don't achieve the righteousness of God. Because justice doesn't rest in my personal dealings with other people. It doesn't rest in me extracting personal vengeance on somebody else for a perceived wrong. That's not the righteousness of God. God was able to act when he flipped over the tables because he was acting in righteous anger. Anger for the righteousness of God. When it's self-serving, when it's personal, when it's what I want, that type of anger doesn't achieve anything. And I think to me, that's a little bit of what he's addressing. You can see that right after this in James chapter 1, I was in James chapter 5. But you can see that right after this, when he talks about James chapter 1, put aside all filthiness, all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. Point is, don't be about yourself. Be about God. I think that's kind of as he kind of unfolds chapter 1. Yes?
It's a personal story that's always comes to mind.
I love personal stories.
This is hilarious. My siblings and I once upon a time decided to quote this verse to my mother that she needed to be a little slower to rap.
Nice. I'd love to know how that went.
I'm slow to rap, but when I rap, I'm going to rap all over you.
Wendy behind you was shaking her head. Did you carry that down a generation? That's an excellent quote. Yeah. Wendy, you might want to write that down for later this week. That's a great one. Yeah. In verses 21 down, or 22 down through verse 25, what does he discuss? If we don't know anything about James 1, we generally know chapter 1, 22. Right. Be doers of the world, not, or be doers of the word, not hearers only. What does he compare it to? 22 through 25. Right. Person who forgets what they look like in a mirror. Exactly. When you look at James chapter 2, this is where we correlated with chapter 1, 22 through 25. We correlated with chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. This big behemoth section. Who are the people that he brings up in chapter 2, 14 through 26? Don't just hear it, do it. That's what he's saying. But who are the people he brings up in chapter 2? Abraham and Rahab. What's the point of bringing up Abraham and Rahab? Abraham makes sense. Paul uses him too. Right, they did something. Right, they did something based on your faith, which ultimately is the point of Hebrews chapter 11. But he brings up Abraham because Abraham took his son up to Mount Moriah, sacrifices him, or is about to sacrifice him. But what does he say to Isaac on the way up? And Isaac's faith, by the way, usually gets overlooked. I think he needs to be exalted in that story too. God will provide, exactly. Which eventually became, if I remember right, the name for that mountain. God will provide, exactly. So the point is that he goes and he actually believes in God. Believing what? That God would do what? That God would raise his son from the dead, even though he had never done it up to that point. That shows the faith that Abraham has. Where does Rahab slip into the equation? What does everybody in Jericho have in common, according to Rahab? They all know, exactly, fear. They all know that the Israelites are going to destroy them. What separates Rahab from everybody else? She actually did something about it. And Rahab's faith is also worth exalting, because what she did was treason. It's not tantamount to treason, it is treason. She would have been killed on the spot if those people had showed up and found out what she was up to. But Rahab did all that in spite of knowing the dangers, because she knew what the truth was. The application for what is us is what? What's the application for us?
When the word of God comes to it's time to act.
Right, when the word of God comes to us, it's time to act. I'm sorry? Right, to do something. Not worrying about the physical repercussions, not worrying about what it may do to this or that. When we know the truth and we're confronted with the truth, we have to act on it. And according to James chapter 2, 4 times he mentions in this phrase, faith without works is dead. The application for the world is, you can know that God is one all you want. The demons do that. You can know that God is holy, you can know this about God, you can know that. But unless you do something about it, what use is it? It's useless. It's completely useless. And you can debate the theology merits of that, pass that all you want, but that's the fundamental principle that he grabs towards right there. So the point that he makes in James chapter 1, verse 22 through 25, don't just delude yourself in action. We took verses 26 and 27 kind of as isolated. We kind of took them by themselves. Verse 26, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. Is that a fair statement for James to make? That not bridling your tongue means that your religion is worthless? It is fair because James makes it. But why is it fair?
I don't think he's talking about a slip of the tongue. He's talking about a lifestyle that's just
Right.
in your face.
Right, he's not talking about, I messed up one time, that means everything I've worked for is gone. That's not, yeah, you're right, that's not his point.
Goes back to verse 20. For the anger of man does not achieve righteousness.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. When I say my anger doesn't necessarily make me holy by itself, yeah. Yes, he does. But in James chapter 3, he brings up the horse and the bridle, he brings up the rudder of the ship, he brings up the great flame that was set by a little fire. What's the point that he's getting at with those? Why does this comparison make sense? Your religion is worthless if you can't bridle your tongue. That's true, you're hypocritical, but what do your words reveal about you?
It's a heart problem.
Right, your words reveal what's in your heart. That's what Jesus mentioned. It's not what goes into a man that defiles him, it's what comes out of his heart and out of his mouth. That's what defiles the man. And so your words truly do define what your religion is like. And if you're here Sundays and Wednesdays, and you claim to read your Bible, and you claim to pray, but you speak and act like the devil, then it's obvious that what you're projecting to the world is not a true representation of yourself. That's, I think, his point there. Howard, go ahead.
But I would say about that, so to speak, if we talk about counting the 10 before we say our act, that's, give you a little time to grow.
My parents used to tell me to wait 24 hours. And if I was still mad about it tomorrow, then I could do something. I usually got to 10, based on how quick I talk, I usually got to 10 pretty quick. So 24 hours is about right for me. Yeah, that's a lot of seconds, though. Yeah, but give yourself time to think. Give yourself time to react. Yeah. Verse 27, what does he mention there? James chapter 1, verse 27. And this does go hand in hand with verse 26, I think. What does he say in verse 27?
Hand in hand with the entire section before it too, that we will say, and this is terrifying for me anyway, going into James chapter 2, you realize he doesn't say baptism one time in that entire chapter.
Right.
Because that's not his point. Even
Right.
though we use it that way, that's not his point. The point is, there is so much that God is telling us to do, and we can say, yes, we are the holy people of God all day long, but if we're not, if our actions, and what he was saying in verse 27, if you're an undefiled religion, is to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, to do what the commandments of God, to be doing what he's telling us to do, and to keep yourself unspotted from the world. Your actions must line up with whatever the doctrine is that we're teaching. If we say it's not faith only, it's faith and works, well, which ones? Not just baptism, but all of them.
Yeah, too many people think that your life or your spiritual life doesn't end, but it kind of hits the biggest point with your baptism. Once I get baptism, everything's just coasting from there. And it doesn't. It begins there. Everything else afterwards is just as important as what you did before. I thought you were actually going to quote it word for word, but your actions must match your faith. What's interesting about verse 27 to me is he says, pure and undefiled religion is this: visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. It's almost as if he's saying something very specific and then he's saying something very big. But why does he bring those two things to describe pure and undefiled religion?
We can't say it all.
He can't say it all, that's true. Yeah.
You can't say those two things, and by those you get the understanding.
Right.
You have to be busy about God's work.
Right.
What's good, which is only God.
Right. What's good is visiting people who need your help, visiting your brother, visiting your sister, but also keeping yourself unspotted from the world. And I would argue too, and this is not a direct parallel with Matthew 22, 36 through 40, the two great commandments, but you kind of see shades of it in that. You love God, you love your brother. You see shades of that here in this verse. And so it's not out of line for James to say that, because it's very much in keeping with, as you mentioned, everything that Jesus would say.
You said it.
Okay, wow, that never happens. Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments? A perfect on-time ending to the class for the first time on board. All right, thank you, everybody. We'll pick up with Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. If you want to prepare, you can read all 9 chapters of 2 Chronicles.